When you look at catastrophic power line fires, what they have in common is it's not just windy, it's unusually windy for that given location where that ignition occurred. That's where utilities are taking action that includes public safety power shutoffs.
Obviously, you're bringing a lot of data into these decisions, but at the same time, it's such a human decision to finally make that call.
Any interruption to power is not what we want to do, but we also understand the responsibility of not starting a fire and the catastrophic effects that come with that.
Are there organizational muscles that helps build that can apply to the PSPS?
We understand the problem better than we ever have before. There's a blueprint now, and there's tools and data available to support that blueprint, to support those plans.
In April, Arizona Public Service executed its first ever Public Safety Power Shutoff. How did it get there, and what can we all learn from the decision calculus required to turn off the power? We'll find out today on Power Perspectives. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Matt Chester, and we're about to get a front row seat to what really happens when the going gets tough at a utility. APS's first ever PSPS was a fast-moving, high-stakes event, and one that was guided by data, weather modeling, and strong utility judgment. Today, we'll hear from APS and their partners at Technosylva about how the decision came together, the tools used to build confidence to make such a major call, and what utilities can learn from the first Arizona PSPS as wildfire risk and operational complexity continue to rise. And a quick note that this episode is brought to you by our partners at Technosylva, so be sure to stick around to hear more about their exceptional work a little bit later on. And I'm thrilled to welcome our guests, Wade Ward, Manager of Wildfire Mitigation at Arizona Public Service, and Steve Vanderburgh, Vice President of Weather and Risk Solutions at Technosylva. Thank you for joining us today, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Of course. And you know, I gave you, your titles out there, but I'd love you to introduce yourselves a little bit more. What are your roles and responsibilities, and how do you two work together?
Yeah, I think before I jump into my role at Technosylva, I think maybe providing a little bit of my background is helpful here because, I'm a meteorologist by training and actually started my career in the National Weather Service. So I spent 10 years in the federal government forecasting the weather. And during that time, particularly when I was in San Diego, I managed the local fire weather program. What that means is we're all familiar with red flag warnings when those get issued when it gets windy and dry. That was the program that I managed for portions of Southern California early in my career. And then after the 2007 wildfires in San Diego, several of which were attributed to power lines, I left the Weather Service and went to San Diego Gas and Electric and was part of that initial early group of folks building a wildfire mitigation program for the utility. And I was there for 10 years, and that's where we pioneered a lot of the work that you're seeing implemented across utilities all over the nation today around situational awareness, weather and wildfire modeling, operational activities, including what we're talking about today, PSPS. And then I went to PacifiCorp after the Labor Day 2020 fires in the Pacific Northwest, spent 3 years there helping to build a program there as well before coming to Technosylva about 2.5 years ago. And now I sort of bring both that agency perspective, that utility experience, and then just the whole history of wildfire mitigation to Technosylva to help inform where our weather and risk products go. How do we improve those to further our mission to help utilities mitigate the risk of wildfire? And I also help with things like innovation. Where do we focus? Where's the priority? And that's a lot of what I do now. And then a lot of one-on-one engagement with our customers. I mean, that's been central to Technosylva since the very beginning. Is we view our customers as partners and vice versa. So I spend a lot of time on the road, meeting with customers, working through their problems, helping with ideation, things of that nature.
Yeah, so again, my name is Wade Ward. I'm the Manager of Wildfire Mitigation and Fire Science at Arizona Public Service. We serve the larger part of the state. We're the largest utility in Arizona. We have the largest footprint on publicly managed lands, which is something interesting, especially for folks outside of California. I started in fire service. It's been a full career in the fire service, most of it in wildland and structure firefighting. Spent a lot of time on incident management teams, and oddly enough, got introduced to the utility space as a liaison to Arizona Public Service on the slide fire in 2015, early 2015, during that time. And a year from that time later, I came to work for Arizona Public Service, and I've been here for a little over 11 years, and manage both the operations side as well as now the new and evolving data analytics and meteorology. So I was that person that didn't know a lot, but I did know that I needed a meteorologist. And shortly after I hired my first, I asked for three more. It's been exciting and a very interesting journey.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And we're here to talk about that first PSPS event, but what's interesting is I'm hearing that before that, both of you had experience in the world of wildfires and what that looked like. So, can you talk to me about what emergency preparedness looked like in years prior before you had to go to this first PSPS event? What did the landscape look like from the utility perspective and also from the APS customers?
As a firefighter, working in Arizona and the Southwest for many years, I was aware of the problem, and so was APS. There was an audit that was done internally in 2014 that identified that yes, we do a lot of things like veg maintenance and other things to mitigate some risk, but we don't have a programmatic approach to it. And that really was the auspice of how this program became what it is today. I was the first fire mitigation specialist that they hired at the time. And, 12 years later, we are now sitting at about 22, 23 folks that are dedicated specifically to wildfire mitigation. That's aside from all the other business units like engineering and IT that are working on mitigation measures as well too. But certainly is a big um, trend that has happened over the last few years, and a real focus from the company. So to answer your question, they've always been very focused on safety, and reliability. Obviously, that's the auspice of generating and distributing power is to keep your customers happy and not turn it off. But we realized very quickly that the risks outweigh the benefits of not turning off the power when it's necessary. And we don't take that lightly. We understand that any interruption to our customers' power is inconvenient to all of us. And we take it very seriously, but we also take very seriously the efforts to mitigate that risk, and not only to our customers, but to the environment.
Yeah, and I'm curious if there were previous, call them close calls where it looked like you might have taken a PSPS action previously and ended up making the call not to, and what looked different then versus now going into that first event that we're going to talk about.
It's been an evolution for sure, and I would say that there are PSPS-like events that we have done and or mitigated for in the past. And just to make it perfectly clear, there are other mitigation measures that look like PSPS. PS is turning the power off, right? But we've always turned the power off when there was a risk to the firefighters and or our community. We've had fire mitigation specialists that have been responding for the last 12 years to fires alongside our first responders, and we've shut the power off many times, um, uh, prior to a fire coming, when a fire got there, being a very coordinated effort to make sure that we don't turn off power to emergency services, but being very selective. So we've done that. We've done non-reclose strategy. So we've put feeders in non-reclose when we're in elevated fire conditions. So the PSPS has become an evolution. Obviously, proactively shutting that off and communicating to customers days in advance is the true PSPS concept. And yes, unfortunately, we've had to do that at least once now.
One thing that I'm thinking about while I hear you talk about this history that is interesting is when there's a fire and let's say the fire department calls the utility to have them turn it off for firefighter safety. Everyone who's affected by that power outage understands it because they see the smoke, they smell the smoke, they see the fire. One way in which PSPS is very different is there's no fire. It's blue sky. And as we know, especially in places like Arizona where you have complex terrain, one part of the neighborhood may not have any wind and the other part may be very windy. So you have customers who see blue skies and they feel light winds, they don't smell smoke. And so then it becomes very confusing. Whereas in sort of these earlier examples, the more obvious examples where there is a fire encroaching on your infrastructure and the fire department's calling to have the power lines de-energized, everybody understands it immediately because they can see and smell the danger.
So when you have those previous kind of related events, are there organizational muscles that helps build that can apply to the PSPS when you think about the procedures, the communication plans, the training needed by employees? How do those, fire type events kind of inform these PSPS events?
Yeah, and I think the big thing there for us is learning how to walk before we run. The very fortunate thing that we have at APS is we've never had a wildfire ignition that has turned to a catastrophic event. And we have put all of this in place as a proactive approach and understanding that the risk is there. We understand the risk. Fortunately, knock on wood, we haven't had anything of consequence ever at Arizona Public Service. And so we have the fortunate opportunity to act now before something happens. That's also difficult. That's like not having a fire and trying to explain to people that we're turning the power off because we don't want to start a fire. And now we're spending billions of dollars on wildfire mitigation and nothing has ever happened. We know the converse of that is never going to be a good story that we're ever going to be able to tell ourselves out of. But it's still very difficult to communicate that to our customers, to our regulators, to our partners. But our leadership at APS has been extremely proactive in that position and said, we are going to do everything that we possibly can before we ever have something happen.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm sure that's a perspective that the customers appreciate, even if when the power is off, it might be inconvenient, but the alternative is mutually agreed upon to be much worse. So that leads us into I kind of want to walk through the day that this first PSPS call was made. What were you guys seeing? What was the data being looked at and analyzed, and what was the ultimate decision making process for making that call?
I'm not a meteorologist by trade, so I'm a little intimidated always being on with Steve, but my team has educated me enough and given me permission to act like a meteorologist on TV. But for us, we do have a team now of 3 meteorologists and a supervisor of wildfire science. They are constantly looking at the forecast, updating the forecasts, producing new forecasts and spot weather forecasts. The team at APS did an incredible job of coming together very quickly within our incident command system and team and put everybody together, got everybody in the room, had the discussions. And then, of course, as we got our daily forecast files produced from Technosylva and some other sources that we use to make sure that we understand, what the conditions are, we ended up in a go no go situation by about 3 o'clock in the morning the day before, and went into our full activation of our incident command team.
Something I think it's worth talking about while we discuss PSPS and the data that we're all looking at ahead of these events to gauge whether or not this is something we need to do. I think it helps to simplify the problem just a little bit because there's probably a lot of folks listening who they don't, fully understand the world of PSPS and managing wildfire risk. And it's a very complicated science and just the way in which you go about mitigating that risk is complicated. It helps to break it up into 2 buckets. You essentially have wildfire risk and you have outage risk. So wildfire risk is kind of what you would expect. It's you've got dangerous fire weather conditions, so it's dry conditions, windy conditions. It's low humidity, it's dry vegetation, right? And then on the outage risk side, that's really uh, it's not the day-to-day outages. It's when you have a higher than normal risk of outages due to strong winds. when you're trying to assess the need for something like a public safety power shutoff, the best way to sort of visualize it is when you have that intersection of wildfire risk and outage risk, that's PSPS. Wade and APS, they have wildfire risk on many days per year across a large portion of their territory, but this was their first public safety power shutoff. And so they do other things, just like Wade mentioned, to mitigate risk when they have wildfire risk, but not that sort of abnormally high outage risk. It's that intersection of those things, that's where utilities are taking action that includes public safety power shutoffs. And so when thinking about how do you assess the need for public safety power shutoff, it's looking at sort of the risk in those two buckets. It's the wildfire risk and the outage risk. And that outage risk is really tied to the winds and especially how unusual those winds are for a given location.
That's perfect. And I think that a really good example of that is our fire potential index from Technosylva combined with WPDI and a couple other components that APS uses as part of the ingredients for the soup for making that type of decision. We have never seen in 2.5, almost 3 years of using the platform and the decision-making process of scores that we saw that day. So we had, not to get into too much complication of the data and the numbers that we use, but if we ever see a 4.67 and greater, or 5 on our scale, we would activate a PSPS. We've never seen that until that day. It was shocking enough that I'm used to seeing yellows and reds when I walk into the operation room and see the list of circuits that are potentially being impacted that day. When I walked in at 2:30 in the morning and I saw purple, I knew that was go.
Yeah, and Wade, you say you don't want to get too technical, but I kind of do want to get a little bit more technical. You brought up that fire potential index. Can you guys share a little bit more about what that exactly is and more specifically how it maybe compares with the ways utilities traditionally think about weather forecasts and wildfire risks and what does it bring to the table in that conversation?
Fire potential index is essentially a fire danger metric. So we were talking about wildfire risk. Risk is fire behavior and consequence. There's the background environmental conditions. That's your overall sort of fire danger, okay? So we trained FPI, or Fire Potential Index, off tens of thousands of wildfires. And essentially what we've done is this looks at the atmospheric conditions, it looks at the vegetation conditions, it looks at drought conditions, things of this nature, and rates the fire danger on a scale of 1 to 5. Now, we spent a lot of time actually focused on utility-caused ignitions to make sure that this index wasn't just all fire conditions, but really honed in on the conditions that are most closely associated with utility-caused fires, and particularly consequential fires. That's how it was designed. The other important thing here is it takes into account the climatology. There are certain parts of the country that are essentially in sort of a flammable condition for large times of the year, and then there are other parts of the country where it's less frequent. And so part of what we did to create this index was to tie in the climatology. And so it's not just when the fire danger's up, but when you're in that tail risk, because that's what we see in terms of those consequential utility wildfires. Power lines spark fires frequently, or can ignite, a tree limb or some grass, essentially anytime there's a problem. But what are the conditions that are associated with those sparks that then go on to become those large consequential fires? FPI is that first essential layer into assessing the background environmental conditions. So it's a way to look ahead and say, hey, the fire weather sort of background environmental conditions we see 4 days from now, 5 days from now, is at a 5, and that is the type of conditions that we see associated with power line fires. We have a secondary scale that's tied to it called the Fire Potential Wind Index. That essentially takes that fire potential index and brings into it those wind percentiles. So it's not just looking at how strong the winds are, but how unusually strong they are. Because again, when you look at catastrophic power line fires, what they have in common is it's not just windy, it's unusually windy for that given location where that ignition occurred. And that's on a scale of 1 to 4. And when you're at a 4, that is where we see catastrophic power line fires occurring. And so the combination of those two things can tell you the following. I've got an FPI of 5. Okay, my fire danger is high. And I have a fire potential wind index of 4, which is the top of that scale, which is associated with catastrophic wind-driven power line fires. So now I can see that the background environmental conditions are the types of conditions that I know are associated with past or historical power line fires, particularly those that were consequential. And so that's basically FPI in a nutshell. And then, of course, all the risk metrics get layered on top of that. So then we know we have fire danger, but where on the landscape could you have that ignition that then goes on to become that consequential fire? And that's where all the other stuff within the modeling comes into play, which we can talk about later. But FPI is initially, it's like that first layer. It's that first look at what's the fire danger that's out there.
That composite score and what Steve was talking about is really important because to give some context to the listeners too, APS serves territory all the way from the Sonoran Desert. We have a transformer that sits a couple hundred feet above sea level, all the way up to 11,000 feet and everything in between. So timber, chaparral, scrub oak, everything in between, manzanita, you name it, we've got it, including the invasive species grasses that have overtaken our deserts and now carries fire way faster than it ever did before. That composite score for us is really important because, like Steve said, I think everybody knows in Phoenix, Arizona, 115 and hot, dry, windy is all summer long. But how do we know which hot, dry, windy day is going to be the worst one? And so that's when we take all these scores in together and better understand not only the risk in Phoenix, but what that translates and looks like in Flagstaff or another mountain community in Arizona, which is really interesting. You know, the whole climatology piece of it is fascinating and also really impactful on the utility industry, not just from gas plants starting up and shutting down. 1 degree difference in an overnight temperature, it makes a big difference. I'm not an engineer, but that's what they tell me when they call the meteorologist. How is it going to be different from it was yesterday? So understanding those worst days, which one of the worst days is really going to be the worst. And so that fire potential index, the wind, and then really doing the reanalysis on the worst days that we've had historically, and then trending that and being able to say, these are the same conditions that we're going to see tomorrow that we had during the pipeline fire in 2019. That gives our operations folks, and kind of back to your question earlier, how do you help not only the industry better understand, but our customers understand? And when you can backcast that and look at past fire events based on today's forecast and be able to paint that picture that this is the same type of weather that we were seeing during the pipeline fire on this date, or the telegraph fire, or any other impactful fire on our territory, it's much easier for the customers and for our employees to understand.
Think about it this way. How many red flag warnings do you get in a year?
A lot.
A lot, like probably dozens.
Yeah, we've just had 3 and we're going on our 4th day tomorrow.
So you get a red flag warning. How do you respond? How do you act? Even if you've got a forecast for red flag conditions, how do you know what that means in terms of how you're going to operate? That's why the FPI is important, because it's not that there's anything wrong with a red flag. There's not. The red flag is telling fire agencies, it's telling the public that, hey, conditions on these days could promote rapid fire spread and growth. And that's not wrong. But as a utility, there are lots of other things that need to be taken into account in order to understand where you're going to take action and the type of action you're going to take. And especially when you're talking about public safety power shutoff, if you remember what I mentioned about wildfire risk and outage risk, right? Red flag warning conditions oftentimes occur well below your thresholds for seeing outages on your system. And also the types of consequences that you can see under those fires, depending on where those conditions are very different. So that FPI is like that next look at, okay, we know we have some dry, windy weather coming. What does that mean to me as a utility? Oh, it's a 5. Okay, now I have a sense for where we are on the scale in terms of this red flag condition. And then you add in the fire potential wind index, which we talked about, and now I understand what that means in terms of catastrophic wind-driven fire that are power line caused. Historically, as Wade said, you can go back and you can look at how all of these fires relate to these scores, and that gives you a much better picture of what to expect when that red flag warning gets issued.
This type of technology is a game changer for us because before we could only use what was publicly available to us. So before we had our own weather stations and our cameras and our AI cameras and Technosylva and the ability to do all this modeling, you were relying on, like Steve was saying, a red flag warning is really designed for the public to create awareness to the public of the potential of danger. But that's different for a fire suppression unit, and it's totally different for a utility or any other industry. How does that relate to this? Because we know that there's a lot of geopolitical decisions that go into forest closures. It's not necessarily because the conditions are bad. It's because the, the in some cases the use of that public land is going to be increased so much, and there is a little bit of an increased fire danger. So we're going to put restrictions on that type of thing. Well, how does that translate to a utility and or any other industry like railroad or something like that? It's different. And now that we have these tools that are very specific to the objectives of a utility, it translates a whole lot better. Like Steve was saying, what are the operational measures that are going to go into place because we're having a red flag? At APS, we no longer rely directly on the National Weather Service to issue a red flag. We issue our own red flag on 13 different districts across the state of Arizona. Sometimes National Weather Service issues at the same time, sometimes they don't. Also, a very windy condition along the Colorado River District might affect a zone of the National Weather Service in Prescott, but it's 80 miles away. And there's no wind in Prescott, but there's 80-mile-an-hour winds across the Colorado River that day. I'm not going to stop work in Prescott for something that's happening 90 miles away. So for us to be able to better understand that and translate it and be able to see that FPI score based on our circuit and our operational districts, it's a total game changer.
It's really fascinating. And I think what's also interesting is obviously you're bringing a lot of data into these decisions, which is imperative. It has to be based on the data. But at the same time, it's such a human decision to finally make that call, both in terms of, it's going to affect all the customers and their daily lives, but also the leadership needed for somebody to say, all right, we're going to make that final call. We're going to make this tough decision to go with the PSPS. Can you talk a little bit about maybe that tension there between what the data is saying and then somebody having to actually, pull the trigger there, and how the leadership and almost the emotional state comes into play?
It's not easy. I'll say that right off the top. Again, going back to the fact that we understand that any interruption to power is not what we want to do. But we also understand the responsibility of not starting a fire and the catastrophic effects that come with that. And so we take it very seriously, but not lightly at all. The decision to have a comprehensive wildfire mitigation plan at APS really starts from the top. And I truly believe that our leadership and our executive leadership understands what that risk is. We've lived through some pretty catastrophic wildfires and loss of life in Arizona. Our folks understand it. They're very in tune with it and compassionate about what's happened in Arizona, and we never want to be the source of that. And I think that drives us every day to make sure that we're making the right decisions for the right reasons, and truly believe that we're doing it because it's the right thing to do and not the easy thing to do. So the support from when we hit a recommended activation score and have that conversation with our executives in our incident command structure, it's very supportive. I think everybody understands that if we get to that point where we're calling an incident command team together to discuss it, that that the data is there, it's well supported and well understood that the risk of not doing a PSPS on those days, given those conditions and everything that we've talked about, it's not just a bad day. It's potentially going to be a really bad day in terms of weather, fire weather specifically, and it's the right thing to do. I don't want to understate how difficult it is, but it's also not difficult, right? All at the same time. It's like, this is a difficult, hard decision, but let's do it.
Yeah, I've been in that room many times for those decisions starting in the days before it was even called PSPS. And Wade's 100% right. It's not easy. And the weight of the responsibility that everyone feels is huge because you know what the consequences are of shutting off the power, but you also know what the consequences are if you don't. And then you also have this culture that exists for generations, which is, as a utility, our job is to keep the power on, its reliability, but you also are trying to balance that with the situation where now you have these dangerous fire weather conditions and you have all these communities that are now embedded in these wildland areas or butting up against these wildland areas, and you have to balance that reliability with the safety, and it is not easy. At the same time, it is easy because you know what has to be done, particularly when you get into those extreme conditions. And when you get into a situation where you have 60, 70, 80-mile-an-hour winds and the landscape is parched, and you know from history that these conditions are likely to lead to vegetation contact, flying debris, damaged, cross arms, it becomes a no-brainer that you need to move forward with something like a PSPS.
The decision that those tough decisions the leaders have to make. But like you were saying, is when you have the data, it makes maybe it's not so tough a decision. It's, hey, it's an inconvenient decision, but it's easy to see it's the right one to make. So that's where those tools seem so incredibly valuable. And now that you have the first PSPS under the belt of APS, I'm curious if there are any lasting lessons that came from it. Obviously, it's other utilities, other regions have had such shutoffs happen before, so it's not breaking new ground in that way, but it's the first time you all had to go through this process. So what kind of learnings would you share with your peers at other utilities, particularly ones that haven't had to make that decision in the past?
I think kind of some of the revelations that came out of it for me were, one was, it was, to be honest, a little anticlimactic. We have been drilling for 2.5, almost 3 years, with every business unit within the company and kind of going through this. And, Steve and I were talking about this morning for the meteorology and the data team at APS. This wasn't a one-day event. This was many days, and there's a lot of work that goes up to shutting the power off. Turning the power off turns out to be quite easy. Making that decision and giving all that data to be able to actually make that decision, that's the hard work. So I would say that one thing, if nobody is, if there's a utility out there that hasn't done it yet, one, that the whole process, if you're planning, obviously turns out a lot better than if you're not planning to do it. But I think being aware of the impact on your team and being able to manage that, I feel like we have just enough people to pull this off. And I mean, if we went into a multi-day event with lots of overnight shifts, we wouldn't be able to manage that with the 22 people on my team. That might sound crazy to some people, but to others, they'd probably say, yeah, when 22 is not even close, that you need to double that. But it's a lot of weight, as Steve was saying, on their shoulders, and it's a lot of time and energy that goes into that. These data files are coming in. There's a new data set coming in every hour, if not faster. And then when you're looking at 250 to 300 weather stations that are on 30-second reads, and you're trying to extrapolate all that data and understand and update incident command throughout the incident, once the power is off, that's a whole nother thing. Um, so I think one of the biggest, try to summarize it into one, is you can never be fully prepared, but the more prepared you are and the more all of the business units within your company are tied into the process of PSPS, the better off you're going to be when the time comes. It's not a surprise. Everybody's been drilling. They know what their role and responsibility is, and everybody goes to work. And our team did an amazing job.
Terrific. Love to hear that. We're having this conversation right as we lead up to the summer months. So as wildfire season develops, I'd love to hear from both of you, how do you think utilities should be thinking about that readiness going forward, especially different than what the status quo has been in the past? How should they be, we have new tools available. We have, technology is progressing. So what does that readiness look like today in 2026?
I think one of the biggest things on the top of my mind is, through this whole process of not having that phrase, analysis paralysis, especially about your data and your process. Don't not do anything because you're not ready to do everything you think 100%, right? There are mitigation measures that you can take. There are operational procedures you can put in place that maybe are not PSPS, but things that will reduce the risk drastically. It doesn't, take billions of dollars to do all these projects, and maybe, you can certainly, our motto has always been, bite off what we can chew, walk before we run, all of those other little catchy phrases that you can think of. Just do what you can to reduce the risk, and if it's in one particular area, focus on that and do it well. We often talk about a harmonic approach to our mitigation measures. So, making sure that, if you're going to do non-reclose, that you have isolation points and communication in place and everything that you can do to minimize the impact to the customer. If you have a 150-mile feeder, what can you do for this 30-mile section and that 10 and that 20, and not bite off the whole thing? Where is your risk, and better understand how you can implement those operational measures, and then mature as you can.
Having been doing this from the very beginning, just like Wade, it has never been easier for a utility to stand up a wildfire mitigation program because the data is now there. They don't have to build models from scratch. We understand the problem better than we ever have before. You have folks like us, Technosylva, we've got 55 PhDs on staff working on fire science, fire weather, data science. And we've got experience working with utilities like Arizona Public Service and improving those models. And those are available. And not only that, but in the electric utility industry, as you know, there's a spirit of collaboration. We get together and we discuss how we're tackling problems. And so for utilities who are coming into this fresh, new, they have an advantage that we didn't have when we started, which is there's a blueprint now, and there's tools and data available to support that blueprint, to support those plans. I mentioned the wildfire and the risk and the outage risk, and we talked about FPI. We're generating 9 billion wildfire simulations a day across the entire country right now. That's on top of all the high resolution weather modeling we're doing every day across the country. That's on top of the 20-year hourly weather history we've recreated for the entire country. And so now, if you're a utility looking to get ahead of wildfire risk, to Wade's point, you don't want to let perfection get in the way of progress or be the enemy of progress. And one of the first things you can do is, talk to those peer utilities who have already been down this road, get a sense for what that blueprint looks like, but then also understand you don't have to recreate the wheel. There's now data and tools available that you can get access to, that you can bring in-house, that could help start putting you on that path toward wildfire mitigation. The last thing I'll say, and this is just something I've seen as a meteorologist in my career, what used to be just a Southern California problem then became a California problem, then became a West Coast problem. And, power line ignitions aren't necessarily anything new, but catastrophic power line fires used to be very rare or infrequent. Since 2017, we've seen at least one, if not more than one, power line fire of consequence in this country every year. And we're seeing them in areas that are way outside of the normal high-risk areas. Places that are temperate rainforest, tropical climates, deserts, and of course, forested mountain areas, rangelands, grasslands, you name it. So, one, understand that this risk is real and that you have this risk. And it may not look like California's risk. It may not look like Arizona's risk, but you have this risk. But the good news is there's a blueprint now, and there's data to support wildfire mitigation plans that you can get up and running much more quickly than you could in the past.
Yeah, no, that's outstanding. And hopefully not only are they, the utilities talking to their peers to hear that firsthand, like you said, but hopefully this conversation is reaching them as well, and kind of highlighting what's possible out there. Because you're right, the threat is only growing, both in severity and where it's popping up. It's never too late to start having this, or too early to start having this conversation. So we appreciate you guys bringing it to us today. And before we let you go, I'm going to put you through our lightning round. So this is just a couple of rapid fire questions that we're going to throw at you that require one word, one sentence, a quick answer. So if you're down for it, I'll just jump in. You both work in a high stress area. So what is your go-to stress management technique?
Nerds.
I get outside.
Excellent. What technology are you watching these days that's going to change what your jobs look like in the future?
AI clearly is going to be a big game changer for us.
Agreed. AI.
Yeah, it feels like that's the obvious answer, but always interesting to say. And then lastly, how do you hope your work in the utility space will ultimately get remembered?
The ability to be able to help other utilities and help people get to the same place that equal to or hopefully greater than where we're at.
I just hope that the work that we did in those early days can help inspire future generations to realize you don't have to be the smartest person in the room. You just have to have a passion for solving and tackling the problem, and the audacity to think that you can actually accomplish it and get it done.
Excellent. I love those answers, and that's a great way to close it out. So it's been an eye-opening conversation today on such an important topic. So Wade and Steve, we thank you once again for your time and your insights today.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you. It was a really good conversation.
And we want to thank Technosylva for making today's episode possible. Wildfire and extreme weather are reshaping the risk landscape for utilities, insurers, and communities across the country. Technosylva exists to help the people on the front lines of those decisions, giving utilities, public agencies, and insurers the intelligence they need to mitigate risk, ask before conditions escalate, and keep communities safe and recover faster. For nearly 3 decades, Technosylva has been doing the hard work of turning fire and weather science into tools that protect lives and keep the lights on, with offices in La Jolla, Calgary, and Leon, Spain to support their global operations. And thank you to everybody for tuning in today for this episode of Power Perspectives. We will see you next time.